Hello, one tired bat. You are live on the RGR live stream.
Oh god, that's terrifying. I've
Oh,
never
hey.
called into a stream before, so
Oh, it'll be all right. I mean, like, I try not to be as intimidating as like other people who do debate content. Like,
mhm.
usually I'm only like, I don't know if you want to say like aggressive. Usually I only like get super heated when other people kind of like start before me. But I try to be like, I try to keep the vibe. I try to keep the chill. What's up?
Not much. I saw that you reached 20K today. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
Happy to see it. You definitely deserve it. Um, and I wanted to talk about the trans athlete thing because I know that you're currently researching that. I missed the stream where people were helping you go through all the research that we found.
Yep, still going through it. It's a lot, but I got a pretty good feel of the literature. So yeah, I will try to the best of my ability to answer or to answer whatever questions you have or talk about whatever it is you have to talk about.
Cool. So none of the questions I have are super data driven. It's more so just I don't I'm a cis woman.
Okay.
And I don't really understand why it's the trans athlete thing that seems to be such a huge talking point when it comes to um just trans issues online. Like I know Destiny has talked about it. You're obviously researching it and planning on talking about it. I think I've seen Vosh talk about it.
Sure.
And it feels like the the few instances where you would have, like, openly out trans people brave enough to, even be out in sports, like, I feel like it's such a small number, there's, like, a disproportionate amount of talk online it gets, and I'm just not really sure why that is.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely have thoughts on this. So there's like a historical kind of context to this that we have to bring in. And it's important to kind of recognize that women's sports over the course of history have always been kind of like a focus of civil rights discussion, you know? Like back during the Reconstruction era, like during like, early to mid 1900s, there was a lot of talk about whether or not like black women similarly had like a disproportionate biological advantage over white women. Um, and a lot of these similar conversations happened back then. Just replace trans with black, right? And so now, mind you, I'm not saying that those are perfectly analogous because like the data with trans people is a little more nuanced. But I mean, looking at it, essentially the way that I kind of come away from it is with the impression of a couple things, right? A lot of the people who talk about trans people in sports are, and let's be real, kind of like what you said, or similar to like what you were talking about, people who largely do not care 99% of the time about like women's sports, right? Like for most people going about their day-to-day lives, like women's sports are a very like it's a very like non-issue kind of thing, you know? In a similar way that like people like trans people going to the bathrooms, I mean, like, let's just be real. Like, most trans people are able to go into the bathroom just fine, just want to take a piss, right? Like, it's really, at the end of the day, not that big of a deal. But there was one really interesting piece of literature that I've been reading, which actually kind of outlines a lot of the main reasons why people bring up criticisms about trans people competing in sports. And usually it comes down to the fact that, like, it's a really convincing argument to people who don't know any better to argue that trans people, especially like trans women, are not women, right? Usually it doesn't focus on trans men as much because, of course, they kind of throw the entire equation out the window. There's one really good example of like a trans guy, I can't remember his name, but like a wrestler in high school who was forced by his state to compete in women's sports and ended up like winning the entire, I think it was winning at state. Yeah, go figure. You had a guy compete in women's sports, which ironically was the thing that they were trying to avoid, but not really because they don't see that person as a man. They see that person as a woman. And similarly, they see trans women not as women, but as men, right? Here with trans sports, it's a really subtle way to be able to make that selling point by focusing on the idea that trans women have some kind of disproportionate inherent biological advantage over cis women. Um, and whether or not, and like, the literature is complicated because basically the answer to that question, like, is that the case? The answer to that question is it depends, right? The literature seems to say collectively, if you have a trans woman who has not gone through puberty and has been on puberty blockers, even playing field, no disproportionate advantage whatsoever. Trans women without elite training who has gone through puberty but then has gone on a year of HRT, similarly no advantage or very little advantage. And then trans women who have gone through elite training prior to HRT or who have not gone on HRT and have had elite training probably have some kind of elite advantage. But even then, like, there are plenty of cis women who have inherent biological advantages already, you know?
Mhm.
Like, there are people, like, there are women in the WNBA who are taller than the average cis woman, you know?
Yeah.
There are going to be women bodybuilders who inherently have more muscle than other cis women, right? Like, there are plenty of inherent biological advantages within women's sports already that people have and normally preclude people. Like, people try to make it out that sports are fair, but they're really not most of the time, you know? If you're
No,
disabled or
yeah,
you
of
have
course not.
something else which prevents you from competing, you cannot compete in a lot of sports, and that's very unfair, you know? And
Yeah.
so what this ultimately boils down to is the idea that, like, the only reason that distinction matters is if you assume that trans women, even if they can sometimes, and we're talking like what you said, like, this is a very, very small minority of people, like, small enough that you can count them like with one hand, right? People who are trans who transitioned later in life after competing in elite sports and who continue to do elite competition. Like, this is a small, small, small minority of people. And
Yeah.
even for them, it really only matters if you assume that trans women are not women, you know? And so usually
Mhm.
to me, that's why this matters so much.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And you bring up the wrestling. The the belief that turfs kind of put forth is the, of course, incorrect belief that trans women are just men pretending to be women so they can, steal trophies from these poor female athletes.
Right.
It leaves me as a cis woman feeling kind of icky because those same women who, I assume they're the kind of feminists who are very pro, like, hashtag girl boss, like women can do anything that men can do,
Hmm.
and would probably applaud cis women wanting to compete against cis men in wrestling specifically. Like, this was a huge thing where
Hmm.
it's happened a couple of times where cis women either there was no female wrestling league, so the girls would want to compete against the boys. And that was a huge controversy. But ultimately, we allow cis women to wrestle against cis men because it's seen as empowering. But then the script kind of flips, and we say, oh, well, we can't let the poor girls compete with these trans women. They'll get crushed every time, and it's just not fair.
Hmm. Yeah. No, and I definitely agree with that sentiment. So actually, it's interesting because a lot of these arguments overlap very heavily with the same kind of arguments in literature on, like, trans predators, right? The idea
Hmm.
that, like, oh, if you let trans women into women's spaces, then they're going to disproportionately they're going to, like, take advantage of that, and they're going to go in and, like, sexually harass women because apparently trans women are all predators. Or if not trans women, then cis men will take advantage of these policies to go in and sexually harass women. Again, all patently false. That research is already up on my Twitter. Um, but it's very interesting because, like, there's actually some literature that shows that, like, most of the people who make these arguments are not actually women who are participating or would be affected by these policies. Most of them are cis men, actually. And very interestingly, because usually they operate from this perspective of, like, a kind of, like, paternalist instinct of or it's like a paternalist protection instinct where it's like, oh, we have to protect the poor defenseless woman from being assaulted by the nebulous whatever the bad thing is, right? Again, like, this is something that was observed. Oh, again, similarity with back during, like, Reconstruction in the 50s. A lot of these same arguments were made with black people in bathrooms, right? Like, that's where a lot of the bathroom segregationist kind of arguments came from. You know, it's like, oh, well, they have an inherently dangerous nature. We need to protect people, which, especially there, we can tell today is absolutely bullshit.
Yeah.
Um, but no, so it is really interesting that like a lot of the arguments that people make really infantilize women. Um, and yeah, like that's clearly, yeah, like no, I totally agree. That's a large effect that they have. Um, which makes it really seem, I'm not sure if this is the impression that you get, but the impression that I get is that like it's much less concerned, it's much less focused on actually trying to vest the genuine interests of women and more assuming what's best for them and then acting on that assumption, if that makes sense.
It feels like, "Oh, well, honey, we can't let you compete against the trans woman because, you know, you're gonna lose every time, and we don't want that to happen to you because that's just not fair." And it
Right. And
it
also
just
putting,
feels gross.
yeah, which both A assumes the intent of the cis woman in that conversation, and also B and like inherently assumes that the trans woman is going to win.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen like some trans people online. Like I always like to use the example of Miss London. Like I'm sorry if you put her in like a wrestling match against like another cis woman, she's probably, and I say this like absolutely adore, like I love her. She will
Mhm.
probably lose.
Yeah.
Or I think about like Natalie. Like she like she is very not strong. Um,
Mhm.
and I mean like I
She's
probably
kind
am.
of waif-like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like people can watch her videos and like see pretty clearly, like she's not exactly going out and winning any like major like bodybuilding competitions, you know?
Mhm.
Like just because you're trans does not mean that you're automatically going to have that you're automatically going to win these kind of competitions, you know? And especially
Yeah.
for people who don't have and this is what the literature says, this is especially true for people for trans people who have gone through medical transition and who have not had like a major background in like, you know, competitive sports or elite training, you know? Because a
Mhm.
lot of the literature shows that like for trans people who have been on HRT for over a year and who have not gone through that kind of training in the past, like they're basically going to perform at the same level of cis women. Um,
Mhm.
so a lot of the, which again is just like more evidence to suggest to me that actually people aren't focused so much on what the literature actually says about people and more just about like what they assume to be true about cis and trans women, right? That cis women need to be protected and that trans women are predators trying to infringe on their spaces. Like that seems to be the motivation for a lot of this.
I don't think anyone would try to argue that Serena Williams needs to be protected from anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, right? It's super weird. And I'm not sure, and no one would also argue that Michael Phelps should not be allowed to compete in swimming, even though he has like an inherent advantage because his lungs are a larger capacity than most other men, right?
Yeah.
But you know, these arguments, like even though no one will make these kind of arguments with cis people, it's really weird that they happen to turn them against trans people, even though they're such a small percentage of the population and often like these conversations will literally have zero impact on the broader world except in like one or two circumstances, you know?
In the process, you make those individual trans people feel like, not great about themselves.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can say from my own personal experience, like I've talked about it on the channel before. I am absolutely terrified to get involved in sports, right?
Mhm.
Because I worry that people will treat me like, and I mean, like this is consistent with the literature. The literature also shows that trans people are have disproportionately like negative experiences in sports and competitions as a result of a lot of these kind of ideas being spread in culture because like for a lot of people who don't know any better, and this is again like the thing that's like very deceptive and why I think that they're really um why they're really hard for a lot of people to grapple with is because they sound intuitively correct, you know? Like the idea that like, oh, because most people don't know as much about trans people, right? So like most people hear trans people and think woman in a dress. They won't even conceptualize what a trans guy is. So they'll hear trans person, they'll think woman in a dress or man in a dress, and then they will hear trans women in sports and automatically think, oh, so men and women sports, right? And so it can sound very intuitively, logically consistent to people who don't know any better. Um, oh, and here's the other thing. So we talked about like sort of the turf mentality, like the turf guys mentality for why a lot of people push this. There's also the fact that a lot of this legislation is being pushed across the nation. I'm not sure if you saw my conversation with the head researcher at the National Center for Transgender Equality. But there's a lot of bills being pushed right now, like a lot of very anti-trans athlete bills.
Mhm.
Um, And some of them are succeeding. Like there's one over in, I believe it's North Dakota, that's really on the warpath to succeeding, and the same for several other states right now. It's like the same thing as the trans bathroom. It's very similar to how the trans bathroom bills were a couple years prior. And because these arguments can be hard to navigate for people who don't know any better, they have a high likelihood of passing. And get this, makes it a lot harder for states to be able to get behind ratifying the Equality Act, you know? Because for every state that ratifies a bill discriminating against trans people, well, it makes it really hard for those states to vote in favor of the Equality Act when they have laws which they would have to overturn to be able to ratify that amendment, Or
Gotcha.
the Equality Amendment. The Equality Act, the Equality Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment. Sorry, I got there. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, but yeah, like basically, to summarize, essentially the main reasons I see people pushing these are like paternalistic turf desires to protect women from nebulous nebulous predators invading women's spaces, and then also a broader desire to prevent states from being able to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. That's my opinion. I'm sorry if that
Makes
was also
sense.
rambly.
No, it's okay.
Yeah,
I had I guess one more question on the topic, and then I got to jump off and make dinner.
yeah, you're
A
totally
lot
good.
of a lot of the more famous, I say famous, the most newsworthy examples that I've seen always kind of seem to focus around track specifically, like track athletes. But are these, like you mentioned, bills getting passed? Are these just getting put across like every sport? Because I know there's some sports that are just flat out co-ed. So would these, would this
Yeah.
kind of rhetoric harm those sports as well?
Yeah, from what I've seen, a lot of the bills that are being passed in most states seem to just say like broadly every sports category, either in high
So
school
dumb.
or just like high school to college level. So yeah, no, it would 100% focus on those because again, like the more nuance. So I know that like there's one example of like there's like a story. There's like a single instance of a high schooler who has gone to a lot of different conservative outlets like PragerU, the Heritage Foundation, the works, and has basically like spread the story of, oh, I was a high school track athlete, but I had the first place trophy or the first place trophy in or spot in a track state finals stolen from me by two trans women, even though other cis women had actually placed in front of her. So there's no guarantee that she would have won either. But like essentially, a lot of people have run with this story. And it's pretty clear when you look at a lot of it. I covered this video a while back. Like the depiction of like of the trans women is just like overtly transphobic, right? Like they will animate them to have like giant bulges in their pants that are very overt to the viewer. They will do everything that they can to paint these people as masculine and as predatory as possible. When in fact, like you look them up and they're just like high school girls, like
Mhm.
it's really, and so like I look at that and it's very unfortunate because that's one of the things that to me betrays their mentality and their instincts, because it's not like they're actually trying to focus on like protecting women's sports. Now they're, to me it's just like they largely hate trans people. And
Yeah, there's
so
like a
when,
level of animosity.
yeah, exactly. Like when you see how people conduct themselves, and mind you, that doesn't necessarily defeat the merits of their arguments if there's some validity to them, which is why I am doing the work to go through all the literature, right? Because like even if people present arguments in very poor taste, there can still be credibility to them. But it does show why they're trying to do it, Like even if, and I'm not saying that there is, even if there would be some validity to what they're saying, it's pretty clear why they're doing it. It's because they just dislike trans people. And so to go back to the question about, oh, well, would these affect like trans people in other sports, especially those where there's literally no case whatsoever? Yeah, no, it would, because their goal is not to just make sports fairer for people. It's to discriminate against trans people. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Sports will never really be fair. Unfortunately, you can't really help the way that your body develops. And with a lot of sports, it's a lot more than just you know how you're shaped. It has to do with, how well you're able to work on a team, your
Mhm.
strategy, all that stuff. Because I know they talk about Serena Williams. What makes her such an incredible athlete is not necessarily like her size or her strength, it's the accuracy with which she can hit the ball. And
Yeah.
it's like all of that just kind of gets ignored because we want to be transphobic, and it's just gross.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like, it is really sad because I don't know, like, I did high school sports. I didn't do them before I came out, but I look back and like I enjoyed doing sports, is one of the best parts of
Hmm.
my life. It made me in a lot of ways into the person I am and probably gave me a lot of the qualities of leadership and confidence that I have, and I want other people to be able to access that. Like, it's a really it's really it really sucks. Because at the end of the day, like, it just negatively harms people who deserve just as well as anyone else to be able to have like a really fun formative experience at the beginning of their life. Um and I don't know. There's just like, obviously you can get really like lost in the weeds of like the everything that kind of surrounds this, but it has a very human impact on it. Like at the end of the day, this has like a very human implication. That like the same experience, like I always like to think back and wonder, like, all right, one of the big reasons that I did not transition in high school, because I knew I was trans back in high school, I knew I was trans when I competed. One of the biggest reasons was that, especially back then, culture was not accepting of me. Culture was not accepting of trans people, and so I basically knew that I had to keep it on the DL because I couldn't afford to come out. I would not have nearly done as well as I had done in sports in my community, and I probably wouldn't be where I'm at today. But I always like to think what would happen if I was born into a culture that was more accepting. If I could have come out, if I could have transitioned when I was younger, if I could have competed in those sports, and just what my life would have looked like. And it sucks because I look back and, like, even though I enjoy a lot of those experiences, that does still kind of hang over me that I wasn't able to form meaningful relationships and live out those times authentically. And I know that other people are not able to do that either, and it's just very sad.
Yeah. Hopefully, the culture will be able to change the culture, and then the next, little Riley won't have that experience growing up. Hopefully, we can make that culture where whoever they are doesn't have to,
Yeah.
hide who they are and keep themselves from experiencing those things.
Yeah. No, and that's certainly my hope. Again, like, I don't know. I like my experiences are like my experience is well done. I'm never going to be a high schooler again. Um but yeah, I would like it that like other trans high schoolers, middle schoolers, whatever, are able to have much better experiences than I did. I don't want to discount all and say that my experience was entirely bad. There are a lot of good things about it. Um, but I do want for other people to be able to have much better experiences than I did. So, all right. I'm monologuing too much. Do you have any other questions?
No, that was it for my first stream call in. That wasn't that bad. So thank you.
Yeah, no, hey, you're great. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the conversation.
Good. I'm glad. I gotta go make dinner. So enjoy the rest of your stream. Congrats on 20K. And yeah, that's it.
All right. Hey, thank you so much. Have a good dinner. Talk to you later.
See ya.
Bye.